This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 952 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. I'm not going to lie. The results from last week, they weren't necessarily the best overall results of the season. I've had bigger hits, but given what I was working with, I think week 12 was the best sleeper show of the season. There were, of course, some misses. Drake May was pretty mid. Jerome Ford didn't see the targets that I thought he might see. Audric Estime's usage was completely unpredictable once again. And Jalen McMillan was a dud too. But I think one of the best calls of the season came last week with Noah Gray. There was also Zach Ertz, Luke Schoonmaker, Devon Vele had a good day, Nick Westbrook-Akine scored again, Amir Abdullah dominated that Raiders backfield, Rashad Bateman scored a long one, Justice Hill scored a long one, and even Will Levis had a usable week. I thought things were going to go very poorly last week, but fortunately, things were just fine. Let's keep that going into week 13. Now, before getting into the sleepers this week, I want to remind you one more time to check out Underdog this Thanksgiving. Right now in the lobby, you can check out the turkey. It's a $5 entry with $200,000 in prizes. It's all centered around one of the best slates of the year, the Thanksgiving slate. You can check that out and more by heading to UnderdogFantasy.com or downloading the app. If you've never played there, make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit offer as well as my rest of season rankings. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. So I'm doing a lot of this before waivers run in order to get this episode out in a timely fashion. So the percent roster numbers for some of these players might be just a little bit off. Not that that's going to dramatically change the integrity of this show. I just want to be transparent. Now, as usual, we're going to kick things off by looking at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll start with quarterbacks. The streamers this week are better than last week, or we should at least feel better about them heading into their games. The first is the guy that I talked about in the 50 transactions episode, and that's Russell Wilson. Russ gets a Bengals team that ranks in the top 5 in adjusted points allowed for quarterbacks. And the Steelers have an okay enough 22-point implied team total. On paper, it looks like a fine matchup. I will say, though, I have some concern that the Steelers will just try to force the run in this game. Teams have been doing that against Cincinnati this year. The Bengals rank last in neutral script pass rate allowed. And we know the Steelers want to establish it. Regardless, Russ has had good yards per attempt numbers in the majority of his starts this year, so if the Steelers let him loose a little bit, he should have a nice game. Even if they don't, I think he's going to be okay. Trevor Lawrence could be back this week from injury, and if he is, I like him against Houston, or I like him enough. The Texans are the 12th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed, and they face an above-average pass rate in neutral game scripts. They're also coming off of games where over their last 4 weeks, Aaron Rodgers, Cooper Rush, and Will Levis each posted at least 16 fantasy points against them. I think there's way more risk than what you'll get with Russell Wilson, with Trevor Lawrence. But I'm anticipating a lot of passing from Jacksonville in this one. I'm going to go back to Drake May too. Last week was kind of forced because the streaming options were so limited. But this week, he at least gets a decent matchup when he faces the Colts. New England's allowed a lot of pressure this year, but Indianapolis is pretty average at creating that pressure. So there's not a massive mismatch there. And on paper, the Colts have been a plus matchup for quarterbacks this season. And May continues to give us 25 plus rushing yards per game, so he's not a bad option. Now moving on to running backs, if Alexander Mattison and Zamir White are out again, even in the toughest matchup that you can find on paper, I think Amir Abdullah can be started. I have him as a high-end RB3 this week if he ends up getting the start. That's because his workload was insane last week. Like I said in the 50 transaction show, he had an 80% route share. He saw the highest snap share by far of any Raiders running back this year. Now, like I said, the Chiefs are a very difficult matchup, but he'd at least see a lot of work, which means he could pay off. Now, I don't know the status of J.K. Dobbins at this time, but if he's out, you can obviously go to Gus Edwards. And Kamani Vidal works as a deeper play too. The Chargers get the Falcons, and while Atlanta's been below average as a matchup for running backs this year, LA has a solid 24-point implied team total. It's a game that could just be generally high scoring. For Vidal's sake, the Falcons have also been an above average team for running backs and adjusted target share allowed. And I think that's the kind of role that he might be able to play without J.K. Dobbins. But Edwards would likely be the goal line back in a scenario where Dobbins is out. And then if that negative game script does hit, which is always possible, Vidal could find the field more. So I've got Edwards a good bit ahead of Vidal. But Vidal's technically a deep sleeper. Now this is more of a volatile pick, but Antonio Gibson's usage last week was kind of interesting. The Patriots were blown out, so it's not surprising that Gibson was used a little bit more than usual, because Gibson's the negative game script back that New England sometimes deploys. With that being said, New England used him more in the early parts of that game, when the game was close. Ramondre Stevenson saw a snap share that was about 20 percentage points lower than normal in the first quarter of that game. And in that first quarter, Gibson had 4 touches. Stevenson also had 4, and then he had this additional target that was incomplete. Now maybe it's nothing, but Gibson finished the day with a 40% running back rush share. That was by far his highest mark since week 6. There's a very real chance that this was just a one-off thing, but I want to at least call him out if it wasn't, because New England backs have a decent matchup this week against Indianapolis. Now at wide receiver, I'm going to look at Carolina. The Panthers get the Bucs, and the Buccaneers are a great defense to target through the air. They've faced by far the highest neutral script pass rate this year, and they're a top 10 opponent for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. I think this could be a Xavier Legette game. Tampa Bay has seen the 4th highest adjusted target share go to outside receivers this year, and Legette has run just a third of his routes from the slot this season. That number was even lower in week 12 with Adam Thielen back. Now Thielen's probably fine in this game too, but I think Legette is the better play. I just hope that he can get a slightly higher target share than usual. He's only been at a 16% and 18% share over his last 2 games. Now, Josh Downs is unlikely to play this week, which means we're probably going to see a trio of Adonai Mitchell, Alec Pierce, and Michael Pittman at wide receiver for the Colts. When Downs was out earlier this year, Mitchell was the one who played that slot role. I would anticipate that being the case once again. And New England, their opponent, ranks 10th in adjusted slot target share allowed this season. They've also been a bottom 5 team in yards per route run allowed to the slot. So I'm throwing these Colts wide receivers in this tier because of Alec Pierce, who I think might be fine, but technically the deep sleeper here is Adonai Mitchell, who's still out there in about 95% of Yahoo leagues right now. He's in a low-key great spot. I think Ladd McConkey might go nuts against Atlanta this week, but Josh Palmer is an okay sleeper. He's seen route shares of 81% and 84% over his last 2 games. Those are significantly higher than the 65% and 63% shares that he saw the 2 weeks prior. And he hit a 22% target share in week 12. That was a season high. Now he gets an Atlanta team that's given up the 4th most adjusted points to wide receivers this season. Now, I didn't think that Palmer looked great against Baltimore, so I don't think this is a smash play by any means, but he should at least have some opportunities. Look, Marquez Valdes-Scantling has seen just 14% target shares over his last 2 games for the Saints, but he's playing a big play role. He's had average depth of targets of 30.7 and 23.5 in those contests. It's according to PFF, which is hilarious and insane at the same time. And his route shares, they've been increasing. They've gone up each week as a Saint, including an 87% route participation rate in week 11, the last time we saw New Orleans. This week, the Saints get the Rams. LA has allowed the 10th most adjusted points to wide receivers this year, and they've allowed the 8th highest completion percentage on 15-plus air yard throws. So maybe MVS could do it again. Now, speaking of big plays, let's go back to Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. I mean, he can't score another touchdown this week, right? Right? Tennessee gets Washington. That's a team that's turned into a pretty average matchup on paper for wide receivers. Westbrook-Ikhine, though, has now hit a 20% target share in 3 of his last 4 games. And we know that big playability is there. So if you need some of that volatility in your lineup, you could look his direction. And then finally, there's Dontavian Wicks. The matchup this week against Miami is not special. But the last time we saw Wicks without one of the other 3 main wide receivers for Green Bay, he finished the day with a 28% target share. We haven't seen him run a route on at least half of Green Bay's dropbacks since week 5. But I would imagine that changes this week. The Packers have a team total north of 25 points at the moment, and this is a way to get a piece of that offense. Now, Hunter Henry's the only tight end that I have for you in this tier. But in games with Drake May under center this year, Hunter Henry has a 21% target share per game rate. He gets Indianapolis this week, and that's the third best matchup for tight ends by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So he's in a great spot to produce. Moving on, let's take a look at players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. So we're digging a little bit deeper here. I've got one quarterback for you in this tier. It's Bryce Young. Like I said earlier, the Buccaneers are a team that sees a lot of passing volume against them. That's resulted in them being the second best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Tampa Bay is allowing over 35 more passing yards to be thrown on them versus a quarterback's season-long average, which is one of the higher marks in football. Young is coming off probably his best game as a pro. He scored 16.5 fantasy points in a tough spot. So I like him for a player in this tier. At running back, Jerry McNichols is the obvious go-to here. Austin Eckler is almost definitely going to miss this week with a concussion, and Brian Robinson, he's banged up too. If they're both out, McNichols is looking at a decent amount of work, mostly because he's operated as their RB3 all season long. And don't forget about Chris Rodriguez either. He should get some work if both those guys are out too. Now, that being said, they do get the Titans, and Tennessee was able to stop Joe Mixon last week against the Texans. Tennessee's actually not been a very good matchup for running backs this season, ranked as the 7th worst matchup for them by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Washington, though, they do have a 25-point implied team total. They could see a decent game script if things go the way projections think, and that'll help McNichols out. If you want a super deep play, what about Chris Brooks out of Green Bay? Game script obviously helps something like this, but he did see a 36% snap share in week 12, his highest of the season. And one thing to keep an eye on is the fact that he saw a 50% route share in that game. That was higher than Josh Jacobs, who was at 31%. Jacobs is coming off a game where he carried the ball 26 times. They have a short week because they're playing on Thursday night. And Brooks will face a Dolphins team that's been worse against the run than the pass. They've allowed the 8th most adjusted points to running backs this year. And it's a fun little revenge game for him. It's a deep play, but there are some outs for him. Noah Brown's kind of on the fringe from a percent roster perspective, so I just threw him in this bucket this week. Washington gets a below average matchup against Tennessee, but like I said, the Commanders have a healthy implied team total. More importantly, Brown has seen a 24% target share per game rate over his last 4 games. That alone's enough for him to get a call out on the show. I'm going back to Devon Vele this week too. He's seeing good target shares in this Denver offense. He's had 15%, 16%, and 23% target shares over his last 3. Now, Vele's been manning the slot for the Broncos. He's run 60% of his routes from that area of the field during this 3-game time frame. And Denver faces Cleveland on Monday night. That's a team that's given up the 2nd highest yards per route run rate to slot wideouts this season. They're also top half in the league in adjusted target share allowed to the slot. So Vele should have a role once again. And then at tight end, I have 3 players for you. The first is Noah Gray. I talked about Gray in the 15 transactions episode, and like I said there, he's been running more routes for the Chiefs. Over his last 5 games, he's had a 58% route share. Before that point in time, that number was 40%. Now he gets a Vegas team that's allowed the 2nd most adjusted points to tight ends this season. So Gray works as a deep sleeper. Theo Johnson's another one. The matchup's not anything special this week against the Cowboys, but over his last 3, he's seen target shares of 23%, 19%, and 20%. He should at least get some work, which isn't something that you can say about most players in this tier. And then lastly, we're going to go even deeper than those 2 plays, and we're going to go with Tommy Tremble. With Jatavian Sanders suffering a neck injury, Tremble's more than likely going to be the clear-cut tight end 1 for the Panthers this weekend. And as I've been saying, teams against Tampa Bay, they tend to throw the ball a lot. And if that's going to happen in a negative game script, Tremble has a chance to see a large number of targets. There's a lack of obvious weapons in that Carolina offense. So I think he's right there with Theo Johnson this week. Moving on to defense is kind of a crappy week for streaming defenses. Dallas was my 15 transactions defense, but they're now rostered in 56% of Yahoo leagues. But there's 2 more that I think might be able to work. One of them is the Seahawks against the Jets, and then New England's a team that gives up a lot of quarterback pressures, so Indianapolis is also kind of a Hail Mary option. But like I said, it's kind of a tough week for these streaming defenses. Now, just given what's available right now, I don't have any underdog picks for you this week, but hopefully you can use some of this information to help with that when more options become available. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You can find me on Blue Sky as well, also at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Like I've said previously, this is the last episode of the week. So I hope all of you enjoy your Thanksgiving, and thank you so much for your support this year and always. It means the world. Let's crush week 13. I'll catch you next week.